Hey, what's up? It's Phoenix and welcome back to my channel. I encourage you to hit that like button and to share with your friends and to subscribe for more quality content from Phoenix. I'm definitely looking forward to making more content on my YouTube channel, so keep a lookout and hit that like button and subscribe today. Now, I have been thinking about an idea of a new series that I want to make for my YouTube channel, and that is a series that I will call The Mind and Art. And this will go into notions of mental illness, as well as the mind itself, and as well as thinking about how this relates to art and to artists throughout time and to art in general. I hope that it will be a really interesting opportunity to talk about some interesting things. So today, as part of this series, I'm going to kick it off by talking about Edgar Allan Poe, who has influenced me since I was a teenager, specifically with my writing, and I definitely enjoy Edgar Allan Poe, and I'm very stoked to talk about him today. Now, you might be wondering how Edgar Allan Poe relates to the mind, to mental illness, to art, and this is a very valid question, and it will take a moment to explain, but let's dive right in without further ado. So, I'm not sure if Edgar Allan Poe had mental illness per se, the way that we might define it. It's possible that he had depression, but I didn't want to assume for the intents of this video that he had mental illness, but I do think there are aspects to his thinking that are melancholic, as you could call them, and that is definitely something to consider. Edgar Allan Poe had quite the imagination, and you might be wondering how he often expressed himself. It's really interesting to think about because his actual content of his stories, of his short stories and poetry, are very much melancholic and describing horror and terror and fear. But his actual writing is very measured and the prose itself is very, very beautiful. And I find that to be very fascinating, that the writing itself is very controlled, even though the content is often horrifying or scary or unexpected and providing suspense and thrills. Now, melancholy itself is obviously not necessarily mental illness, but it is a modus operandi, as you could call it. It is a way of going about the world and thinking about things. And when I think of melancholy, I often think of someone who is thinking about existential things, someone who is realizing the terror of life, so to speak, the shadows of our realities, the unknown. And I think that this was what Edgar Allan Poe definitely excelled at. He was part of the Gothic tradition in literature, which included writers such as Anne Radcliffe, as well as Horace Walpole, and then that lineage spread out further after Poe to H.P. Lovecraft. And the Gothic is a genre that often tries to capture fear and the unknown, and Edgar Allan Poe is often considered a master of this kind of thing, of this genre, of the Gothic. I wanted to talk briefly about one of his short stories, which is called The Pit and the Pendulum, and I think this is a great example of fear and of thinking about how Poe could capture fear. Basically, The Pit and the Pendulum features a character who is basically strapped down and he's beside a pit, and there is a pendulum, basically a scythe, a sharp weapon, a sharp tool, and a machine basically that is moving towards him, and it's going to kill him. And the suspense of the story is amazing because you are realizing that it's getting closer and closer. And this is often a metaphor for creeping death, or for anxiety, or for the fear that we might have of the unknown and the things that are going to hurt us. The Pit and the Pendulum, I think, is a great metaphor for this kind of creeping death and these fears of the unknown, the things that we can't control, but that are right around us, just waiting to take over and basically to kill us. As a society, how do we look at death? Well, death was a theme that Edgar Allan Poe often wrote about, and I would say that death is often something in our society that we don't talk about. Death is very taboo. And I definitely understand the reasons for this, and I myself would not necessarily go around talking about death per se, but it is definitely a very taboo thing, and it's something that affects us. And I think Edgar Allan Poe captured the fear of death. As an example, he was able to capture this in his story Ligeia, which was literally about a woman who dies, but then basically haunts the narrator by coming back to life and by haunting him, this kind of coming back from the dead, basically. And this definitely represents a fear of death because the narrator is terrified. It definitely sounds horrifying, and it is a lot to consider, no denying that. I recommend this short story as a side note, along with The Pit and the Pendulum. But if there's any theme that can be drawn from these two stories, it is that fear of death. As I said, we don't really talk about death, and so we have to find ways to explore that, and Poe was able to explore that by way of his writing, which I think is very deep. So Poe imagined death to be close to all of us, that there's no escaping it, and this can definitely be scary. Now, as you may know, it is one of the most famous poems in the West, and one of the most famous poems ever written, and that is The Raven, which Edgar Allan Poe wrote. And this again captures the themes that we've been talking about, such as creeping death and fear and the unknown and anxiety and despair even. And if anything, The Raven goes into notions of melancholy by depicting a narrator who is afraid, and who is afraid of the raven and what that raven represents. As you remember, nevermore. Quote the raven, nevermore. And this is a very deep thing to consider. It's not an easy thing to think about how the unknown is right there, our despair and our disappointments and our sadness and our melancholy, and how it is always there, and how we can't escape it, just like the raven. Now, I do think that such states of melancholy are often exaggerated, but I think they represent a very real vein of human life, and that is these things that we can't control, these larger-than-life things that basically cause a lot of suffering for us and that are always there and that are always lurking in the shadows. And I think the value in writing something like this is really, really incredible. And I think because it puts a mirror to us. It puts a mirror to us and to our life and allows us to think about these things in a very deep way. And I think that is one of the greatest contributions of Poe. And even though not everybody would understand his writing, not everybody would relate to the things that he is saying, there is something really true about this idea of horror and of fear of death and of life itself and of all of these things that are unknown. I think that it's valuable for showing a perspective. And so again, while I don't know if Edgar Allan Poe had mental illness per se, or even depression, I realized that he did suffer in his own life, and he dared to try to capture that intensity and that life that he felt through his writing. And I think allowing us to explore these themes, which are often not talked about in our culture, is very important. And I think that it definitely allows for a lot of possibilities. So the question you might be wondering is, did Poe confront these things himself? And I would assume that he did. Maybe not fully, or at least as much as he possibly could, because he had a lot of things that he was going through. As you may know, his life ended, his death happened around tragic circumstances as well as unknown circumstances, and we don't really know what Poe experienced except for that fear. And I do think that Poe confronted it in his own way, specifically through his writing, and I think that that's very remarkable. So yeah, so this is Phoenix, and I hope that you enjoyed this discussion on Edgar Allan Poe. I'm going to continue to make videos on the mind and art, and I hope that you will join me for the ride. So definitely keep a lookout. This is Phoenix, and there will be much more to come. Thank you for watching.